Thanks, everybody. So, thanks for taking some time out to hang out here. And today we're going to talk about motion for the web. Now, when I say motion, and let's pretend we're not at a web conference. And this can be interactive here. This is a nice, cozy setting. What pops into your head? So if I say motion, what do you think of? Animation. I think I heard someone say cars. Okay. Yeah? Maybe you think Disney, Pixar. Maybe you think of like claymation. All of that stuff's motion, and it's all valid. And if you go looking, you'll find great material on how to make things work. The kind of stuff you'd fire Adobe After Effects up for, but not a lot of people seem to be talking about how a team considered motion as part of a process for building for the web, or how designers and developers collaborated on bringing it to life, or even just convincing project stakeholders that it's worth the spend in the first place. And so at Viget, these are the things that we asked ourselves when we sat down with the question of how can we better integrate motion into our projects. So we'll cover today just some of the experiments, and we've boiled it down into 3 C's, if you love alliteration like I do. We'll talk about some ways to classify motion to make it easier to talk about. We'll build a complexity scale so that we can earmark enough time for the work as it begins. And then we're going to spend the last part talking about how best to collaborate when we work on the actual business of bringing it to life. So let's start a little bit with classification. When something gets classified, and just as a warning, I meant to say this at the beginning, there are going to be things moving up here. If you have anything that causes discomfort when that does, just as a fair warning, I didn't want that to catch anybody by surprise, but I already did it. So classification, if I tell you an animal is a reptile, you can infer a couple different things about it. You can say it's probably cold-blooded, actually very likely cold-blooded, has scales, likely has teeth unless it's a turtle. And all of these elements are tied to its classification. They're characteristics that they're shared. So to classify motion, we need to build up a set of shared characteristics. So I want y'all to take a look at this video a little bit. We've got some shapes here. We've got like a rectangle. We've got some triangles happening. And the question is like, what's going on here? And y'all can feel free to shout out too. CSS transforms. We've got, they're chasing, okay. Bullying. What's the circle doing? Hiding. Okay, y'all are using some great words to describe that, but these are just shapes, right? These aren't alive things. And what that was, it was a study by a 1944, hello, Mike. Study by Fritz Heider and Marion Simmel, and they were studying what we just did, which was called anthropomorphism, which is fancy talk for giving human attributes to non-human agents. Our brains are really great at taking lots of inputs and turning them into meaning. We're wired to look for intent and meaning in motion. And this is great because this means that this is something that we can tap into when we're dealing with motion. So this will be our first characteristic of motion. Motion is an emotional medium. It's like a nonverbal communication of design. And we can convey a lot of emotional information in how we make things move. So let's look at a few examples. So let's take a look at this animation. We've got some bouncing shapes. There's some spinning going on here. You could say it's happy, upbeat, energetic. What about this one? We've got things moving. Suddenly they're breaking into the third dimension. So things are not exactly as it seems. It gives kind of like a sense of sophistication, something control and order. But not all motion has that much emotional information. Sometimes information is just information. So here, a button state was triggered. We're showing the user that something has changed in the interface. It's motion, but there's not a lot of emotional meaning in this. So with our characteristic, we can say something is going to fall either more factual or it's going to be more emotional. But we're not at a point where we can classify emotion yet. We need more characteristics. So let's add another characteristic. Motion is implemented in systems. And kind of like a flock of birds, if you think each individual bird is relatively insignificant, but if enough things start to follow the same rules, then they start to form something much larger than the individual interactions. And that's what I mean by systems, individual components following a shared set of rules. So this is an example from Google's material design, and they have a whole set of transitions that show how things should move in and out of the interface. And again, like the flock of birds, each individual thing is relatively insignificant, but if enough things start to follow the same rules, then it starts to feel like a material design interface. So back to our measures, we have our emotional measure, and now we're adding a systems measure. We can tell whether something's integrated or isolated. And I bet you can see where this is going. We have quadrants, which means we can name things. And that's great. So I'm going to be going through all of these. If you're trying to write down, don't worry. We'll go through them one at a time. But we're going to start over here on the functional zone. So we're going to go functional and isolated. And we're calling these functional motion patterns. They're factual and isolated. So in this one, you can see that the user interface is responding to input. We have people being kind of dropped in and out as they're assigned. There's not a lot of emotional information here, but this is where most of our motion patterns are going to live on a website. Button interactions, menus, closing and opening. This is functional motion. So let's take functional. We're going to stay on the left side. We're going to move up to systematic. This is an example of a site, and I think it kind of shows what it's like when we have a lot of individual components that start to follow similar rules. We've got distortions. We've got a lot of squigglies happening here, and there's also a lot of breaking of the grid. So this kind of gives a feeling of breaking outside of the box, and this is what we mean by systematic motion. It's more of a system. So let's hop over to the other side. We'll talk about set piece. A set piece motion pattern is something that is emotional and isolated. So this is the Figma's website. Many of you are probably very familiar with this. But we have these little animations on here that give a feel of what it's like to work in the application. There's a sense of collaboration as the cursors fly around, and it's conveying a little bit of emotional information, but they're contained. They're isolated into these areas, and that's what makes them set piece animations. And then our last quadrant here, we have narrative. So a narrative one, it's probably one of the hardest ones, I think, to pull off because it requires a lot of work. In this particular example, we've got just a series of complicated but well-done interactions, almost like a comic book telling the story of this product in a way that could have a lot more impact than just text on a screen. So that's classification. We've defined 4 zones of motion, but it doesn't really help us plan anything yet. So how do we ensure that we have enough time for the actual work? So let's go to our second C, which is complexity. With anything complicated, we can break it down. So let's think about how we can break motion down into smaller segments. The biggest way I think you can break motion down is to say whether it's going to be augmentative or integral. And what I mean by augmentative is that it builds on top of something. It's not, if it adds to it, but if you were to take it away, the base experience is the same. So I've got an example of this. This is a website, and it's got menus that come in and out. It's got some nice hover states as you go down. We've got things that appear on scroll that draw your attention down. But if you take all of that out, the design is still functional. It doesn't take a lot out of the experience to remove it. So it's augmentative. Integral motion, though, is where if you take the motion out of the experience, it's greatly reduced. So this is a restaurant site, Tiger Milk, and there's stuff going on. We've got kiwi limes and giraffes and wheelchairs. We've got a lot of great text transitions, but they don't serve an informative purpose. They're aesthetic. So if you were to take all of this stuff out of it, the experience is going to be wildly different than with them in. So this is integral. So when we have an experience, we can look at it and say, well, this is going to be augmentative or integral. But we need more ways to break this down. So motion also has technological complexity barriers. And what I mean by barriers is not like a gate, but something like the sound barrier, something that requires enough momentum to pass through. These are tipping points. And I think with technology barriers, we've said, there's three kind of basic general areas with two barriers that we can look at. So our first barrier is being what's possible with native browser functionality. A lot of what we've talked about today, what Killian and Alex were talking about, these are things, this is a growing area. This is actually a very exciting area. So these barriers are a little squishy. But there does come a point where there's something that you can't do. And that's what that barrier is. When you take from the browser and you're reaching into a general purpose motion framework like GreenSock, GSAP, Anime.js, Framer Motion. There's lots of them that exist out there. So that's our first barrier. And then our second barrier is specialty techs and skills. So things like 3JS for 3D animation, or if you're doing a really complex data visualization and you've got D3 or Matter.js for physics, those sort of things also separate from when you reach from the general purpose into something much more specific. So we can take our main divide, layer in our technical barriers, and we're going to break this down a little bit more. So we're going to split native in half, and you can see that we've got the integral divide here in the motion framework too. And that's not to say that you can't make an integral experience with native browser tech. You can. It's just typically you're going to be reaching for something like that to help you. So if we clean this up, we've got 5 tiers of complexity that we can talk about with motion. And this tiered system kind of gives us a general sense, it's not an exact science, of what we're going to be aiming for when we talk about complexity. And I'll give examples for each one of these. So let's start here in tier 1. So here we've got a simple animation. It kind of flips the card for you to figure out like which one that you're on. So this is augmentative. It's using native tech, and it's very adequate and relevant to the situation because we're asking them to make a decision. But this could be an example of tier 1 motion. From there, we can step up to tier 2, which is augmentative, but we're using a higher level. So this one's got some CSS transition. The whole wheel is spinning on the page, some hover states. There's some sticky kind of indicators that move through here. And like I said, this particular area is exciting. There's so much stuff that's going to be available in the browser soon. We've got scroll-based animations. We've got view transitions. We've got all sorts of things. The property thing that we were talking about earlier, animating CSS variables. So there's a lot of stuff that's going to be possible soon. But when we do reach for frameworks, it's because they're going to give us a way to do something in a performant way that's kind of hard to do. Like this particular site has a lot going on bound to scroll. And this is where something like a motion framework is really going to help it. But again, it's augmentative because the design could hold up on its own. The motion here just adds a lot of extra aesthetics to the experience. So now we're going to cross another divide. Everything up until this point has been augmentative, and now we're going to jump into the integral section. So here's an example where we've got these kind of 3D, faux 3D transitions into different things. And we're at the point where removing these interactions, removing these transitions, the site is just simply not going to be the same anymore. So that's what kind of classifies it as a tier 4 system. And then here in tier 5, where we've got specialist technologies, this is an example of a site for all things, banking. But it's a custom 3D game-like experience where it's fully 3D, and you can see in a second, you walk around, you choose your avatar, and you talk to people about banking. How they got that approved by the budget, I don't know, but this was actually quite awesome. But this is an example of tier 5. Like, we're doing all sorts of crazy things here. It may still be up. I encourage y'all to check it out. And once we've got these things in tiers, like we've got numbers associated with these things, we can start to talk about how long things are going to take. So a number that we've been kind of working with at Viget is just kind of general ballpark. We're going to say if the motion is augmentative, so that's like tiers 1 through 3, we're going to say it's going to take 25% or less of the combined design and development time. So when we're planning a project and we're sitting on the onset and we're like, well, we're not really going to do like a ton of it. It's going to be augmentative. Is it going to be tier 1, 2, 3? You know, like maybe we want tier 3, so maybe it's going to take 25% of that time. We can earmark it and say, we're going to spend that time on motion, and it's going to take that much just to make sure we have. And if it's going to be integral, we know it's going to take a lot more than that. But now we've got a lever to kind of push and pull that number way before anything ever gets designed to make sure that there's enough time to do it. So we've talked a little bit about ways to classify. We've talked about just kind of complexity tiers. And now we're going to talk about ways to actually design and build it. So collaboration. Just for a little selfish curiosity here, interactive portion. How many people here are developers? Okay, I expected that. How much, do we have any designers here? Okay, we got a few hands. Awesome, I see you. Do we have any project managers or people who work directly with the client? Okay, we've got a few. Awesome. Well, hopefully you will all get a little bit that you can walk away from this. And if you take nothing else away from this talk, I just really want to emphasize that everything we do is going to be more effective when we're facilitating collaboration. I feel like that's where the magic happens, that's where the wheels of culture hit the road, and that's where good work lives. So if we're aiming at this constantly, we're only going to be helping ourselves. And I'm going to start this with a hot take. So high fidelity motion design, I would argue, is for clients only. I don't think we need them to build. I feel like they're only necessary if you really need to get the client on board with where you're going. So this is a list of options. I know the text is small, but there's a lot of things that we can do in designing motion, you know, inventories, documentation, animatics. And what we'll typically see on a project in terms of a project plan is either nothing or jumping all the way to the highest of fidelities. And clients respond well to video prototypes, but it's not always an efficient use of our time. We have a form gap problem, as you all are aware, that we design in software and we build in code. And everything we do has to cross that divide at some point. And video prototypes and high fidelity design artifacts mean it's a lot of work that we have to redo. So I feel like there are 3 techniques that are effective when we're talking about working together to build motion. Well, these 3 and a special type of code prototype that I'll talk about at the end that we're calling iterative motion jams. So we talked about emotion at the beginning of this. So descriptor pairing is a way to tap into that. By using 3 categories of adjectives, we can start to build a system with just 3 words. And we have a few recommended types that we have found good success with. So speed, how fast something is moving, the weight or like the feel of the material, and then the feeling that you get from the emotion. So when you combine these 3 categories, you can get a statement like soft, bouncy, and joyful. And there's a lot of things that you can infer from this. You might say that things have like a slight squish, like a rubber ball or a beach ball. You could say that there's a lot of elements that rotate around each other. There might be bursts, you know, confetti for joyful. There's a lot we can take from these 3 words that we didn't have to document out. And that means that we don't have to painstakingly label each interaction. We can aim at a concept and use these to build a system. Another really helpful deliverable is what we're calling the motion inventory. And are any of you familiar with Dan Mall's visual inventory back when responsive design was becoming a thing? A few people have heard about it. Well, this is that, but for motion. So the way it works is you go out and you find a live example of something that's close to what you're trying to do, something that already exists, and you document what parts you'd like to keep and what parts you'd like to change. Shove it together in a slide and take it to the client. You get the benefit of the client being able to respond to a live built example with the context of what you're doing, and that gives a client something that they can react to early on and quickly. So you can start getting feedback of like, well, I don't know, I don't like this idea at all, or, you know, our CEO has motion sickness, so this concept is terrible. But getting that reaction early on can be valuable when you need that kind of speed. And another really helpful, I think, utilitarian artifact is storyboards. And you've probably know exactly what these are. You've seen them. There is a sequence of stills of how something is going to move. Typically, you'll see them in a, you know, an anime or like a movie about the scene of it. And we don't really get to control where the user goes in an interface. But if we take an element or a specific motion pattern by itself, we can build up these stills to really understand the timing and sequence of things without having to do special types of code or different things. You can do this with just your normal design tools. So let's talk about these jams for a second. To be specific, we're defining them as a closed feedback loop between designers and developers, can happen real time or asynchronous, and it happens in a code prototype. And it can be integrated to the project itself or isolated, just off by itself. And what we do when we start working together like this is we can take all of these types of artifacts and compress it down, except for the do nothing option, and model it in a conversation. We can jam on timing, speed, movement, and a feel in a much more efficient manner, rather than having the designer try to document it all and lobbing it across the fence. And I'll give a quick example of what this can look like. So we had a recent project where there was one element that one of our designers, Andrew Greason, he had made with the intent of motion, so these little squiggly things on the pictures. And when we met up to talk about it, he was able to articulate what he was thinking. He wanted them to move soft, quiet, undulating like brainwaves. And so I said, okay, I know something that's sort of like that. I've seen this before. What if it was like this? And I was able to gut check it with them. And we were able to then just move straight to a prototype in which we passed it around. We tweaked the time, the line thickness, just by passing the prototype back and forth in Slack or a link to it. And that was it. Like, it didn't have to be hard. We didn't really name what we were doing. I would doubt Andrew even knew he was in an iterative motion jam. We were just collaborating. And that's what it's intended to be, just a fast track with gentle bumpers into collaboration. And it wound up with the minimum things that Andrew had to document and the maximum amount of code that got integrated into the final product. In fact, the client got to review it just as part of the normal QA process. And so now we've gone through our 3 C's. Let's talk about just putting it together. So when we're considering a project, we can make a statement like this. And this statement is going to give us a lot of information about what we're intending to do in the project. We're saying it's going to be tier 3. So we know it's going to use the JavaScript framework, but it's going to be, it's not going to be integral, it's going to be augmentative. We know that we're going to create several set piece animations. So they're going to be emotive, but self-contained. And that we want to have functional animation patterns, but we want them to do just slightly more than what they would do on that. And then you can come up with an action plan. Say, we're going to get a motion inventory. We're going to get early client review for approval. And then we're going to use descriptors to kind of come up with what we want. And then we're just going to immediately jam on a prototype to get it fleshed out, which could happen like even while you're getting the backend set up. So that was a lot. I know I ran through that really fast. And I don't know, do we have time for questions? Yeah, let's do some questions. If anyone has some, I'd love to answer them. Question in the back.
How do you go about building consistent animations into a design system? If you're using something like Storybook, what have you found is a good way working with designers to communicate sort of the, almost like the tokens or the consistencies with animation?
Yeah. The question is, how do you create consistent animations in something like Storybook, kind of like as a part of a larger app? Okay. And I think that's a great question and a difficult one. And I think the answer is not necessarily a technical response, but a cultural one, in the sense that when you have like something like the descriptors as part of your system putting out, like if you have that soft, bouncy, and joyful as something to aim at, that gives people, even if they're moving in and out, because sometimes in a team you've got someone that comes in, they don't know what's going on, they weren't there for the earlier conversation, but artifacts like that aren't too difficult to produce, and I think start to lead to a lot more consistency in it. And then even just having some guidance from the people on the team saying, reviewing that, and if they know that that's where we're aiming at, having something to aim at, I feel like breeds that consistency. But I do feel like that's almost more of a communication thing rather than a technical aspect. Great question, though.
You had a lot of, between the quadrants and the tiers and the emotional categories, right? Do you have those published or like a worksheet or something like that for other? Because it seems like something your organization has had a lot of success with. Is this published in a way that other organizations can take it and use it?
Sure. And I'll repeat the question just for everybody. The question is, are these published anywhere that we can see it? And the answer is yes, we do have a series of articles at viget.com that you can go on. I believe we may or may not have a motion category that you can go see. But if you search for motion, you'll likely find them. We did a set of 3 articles on them last year. So also, great question. How are we doing on time? Can we do more? Okay. Any other questions? All right. Well, thank you all. I really appreciate the opportunity to come out and talk to you all.